Welcome to another Deep Dive. As always, we'll be extracting the core insights from a mountain of material, all for you, the listener.
That's right. And for today's deep dive, we'll be exploring the world of ancient political philosophy.
Now, we know you are coming to this already having a background in philosophy, so we're not going to treat this as a basic introduction to the subject.
Exactly. We'll be going beyond just summarizing the main ideas of the key thinkers.
We really want to get to the heart of how they were thinking.
Yeah, what were the arguments behind their arguments?
What were some of the interesting connections that they made?
And what are the really enduring questions that they wrestled with that still fuel philosophical debate even today?
So to get us started, can you give us a brief overview of the sources that we're going to be diving into?
Sure. So the sources we've put together focus on ancient Greek and Roman political thought.
Okay.
And the time frame is from the 5th century BCE to the 5th century CE. Now, we decided to set aside the really important parallel developments happening in Jewish and Christian thought during this time period.
Right.
Just so we can stay focused specifically on this classical tradition.
Yeah, which is a tradition filled with some absolutely monumental thinkers. I mean, you think about it. These were philosophers like Plato and Aristotle who were grappling with some of the most fundamental questions that we can even ask. I mean, things like, where do political institutions even come from?
Right.
What does it even mean to talk about justice and equality?
And how do those concepts actually have philosophical weight?
How does our individual ethical framework as individuals relate to the way that political life is structured?
And what are the different ways that we could model a state?
I mean, those are questions that are just as relevant today as they were back then.
Absolutely. And it's really important to keep in mind that while they were operating within the context of the ancient city-state, which is obviously very different from the nation-states that we're used to today, those core philosophical problems that they were identifying, the structures of their arguments, and the persistent tensions that they were exploring within their thought, those offer really, really valuable insights for us to think about politics philosophically even today.
All right. So I guess we'll dive in. Let's start with ancient Greece, where the relationship between politics and philosophy was so deeply intertwined that it's almost difficult for us to even conceive of today.
Right. It's fascinating how deeply connected they were. And that connection's even visible in the etymology.
Okay.
So political ultimately derives from polis.
The city-state?
Exactly, which was the very center of life in ancient Greece.
Right.
And then philosophy, we know, means love of wisdom.
Right.
Which, of course, would naturally extend to wanting to understand how to live well within that polis.
So, in a sense, the emergence of these independent city-states really created this kind of laboratory, this tense environment where people were trying to work out what the good life even was.
Yeah.
But, of course, disagreements on that were inevitable.
Of course.
So it became this really concentrated space for working through these fundamental issues of how we live together.
That's right. And right from the beginning, the idea of justice was really central.
Okay.
This wasn't just some kind of abstract ideal that they were thinking about.
Right.
It was seen as the fundamental bond that held the city together. It was like this civic agreement that was meant to benefit all of the citizens, not just a select few.
Yeah.
And we see a really powerful early example of this in Hesiod's Works and Days.
Okay.
Where he contrasts this brutal image of a hawk dominating a nightingale with this image of a city where just judgments prevail. Yeah. Even for outsiders who come to the city, there's this sense of a system that is operating by fairness.
That's such a striking and powerful image, right? Like raw power versus this system that's, at least in theory, striving to provide this framework of fairness.
Absolutely.
And that idea of justice really throws a wrench into things when we start to think about equality, which is another huge theme in political philosophy.
Right. And the question of equality is where we get some really interesting philosophical problems arising.
Yeah.
Because the question is, well, who counts as equal?
Right.
So you have oligarchic systems, which are often dominated by the kolokagathoi, the well-born, the wealthy.
Right.
And they tend to think about equality as something that belongs just to the elite.
Okay.
Democratic systems, on the other hand, would argue for a broader sense of equality.
Okay.
So the many would be considered politically equal.
Okay.
At least among free native-born men.
Right.
And Sparta is another interesting example where they have this emphasis on hoi homoio, the equals or peers.
Okay.
So again, it's like these questions of equality are always being applied to a specific group, not to everyone.
So from a modern perspective, it's fascinating how some of the issues that are front and center for us today were really not that prominent in early political philosophy.
Right.
like slavery, for example, which is obviously a huge issue in the modern world.
Yeah.
It wasn't really a primary political question initially.
Yeah, although we do see Aristotle later on trying to develop a philosophical justification for what he calls natural slavery,
Right.
which is obviously a very controversial concept.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the exclusion of women from active citizenship in Athens.
Which was just the reality.
I was just taken for granted, yeah.
Yeah.
Although we do see some philosophical reflection on it occasionally,
Okay.
often kind of filtered through the lens of drama or satire.
So for someone who's coming at this from a philosophical background, what's really key to understanding the Greek context, I think, is this idea of what scholars have called the Greek discovery of politics,
Right.
which is this really radical notion that citizens could actually participate in decision-making, which we might take for granted today. But it was revolutionary at the time.
Absolutely.
The polis wasn't conceived of as some kind of detached state apparatus.
Right.
It was the citizens themselves.
Yes. Athens was its citizens.
And rhetoric played a huge role in shaping this culture of participation.
Yeah.
Archaic poetry, filled with ideals of civic virtue and civic religion, were all tied up in this.
Yes.
So there was this emerging consensus that the polis was central,
Right.
that justice was essential. But this wasn't without its challenges.
Of course not. And that's where we get the sophists coming in, who really disrupt things.
Yeah.
They start this nomos fusus debate.
So just to break that down for our listeners, nomos refers to the laws, the customs, the established norms of a society.
Right.
And fusus points to nature, the way things are inherently.
Exactly. And the sophists start to question whether these laws and customs that define political justice were actually based in some objective natural order, or if they were just human conventions, or even tools that were being used to advance the interests of particular groups.
Right.
So, for example, Protagoras sees this development of political life as a testament to human skill
Okay.
and the agreements that we can make with each other.
Okay.
Whereas Thrasymachus offers a much more cynical view.
Right.
He argues that in any city, the people who are in power, they're just imposing laws to serve themselves.
So it's a really fundamental challenge, right?
Absolutely.
To the very legitimacy of how we organize ourselves politically.
Yeah.
Are these systems based in some kind of inherent rightness?
Right.
Or are they just products of power dynamics?
Yes.
The sophists really explore this in different ways.
Yeah.
So are laws these beneficial constraints on our like baser instincts?
Right.
Are they instruments of exploitation?
Yeah.
Or are they a way for the many to control the powerful few?
It's a really interesting debate.
Yeah.
And it's against this backdrop of these really intense questions about the nature and the purpose of the political that we see the emergence of political philosophy as a really distinct and self-conscious mode of inquiry.
Yeah.
So thinkers like Socrates and Plato, they weren't just participating in these debates.
Right.
They were really trying to establish new philosophical foundations for thinking about the political.
Okay. So that brings us to Socrates, who's such a pivotal figure because he really marks a turning point, I think, in the history of philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Cicero even said that Socrates was the first philosopher to bring philosophy down from the heavens.
Yeah.
You know, from these abstract cosmological speculations
Right.
into the realm of everyday human life.
Yeah, into the agora.
Yeah, exactly.
Into the marketplace.
So from a philosophical perspective, what's really significant about Socrates is his focus on ethics.
Right, because before Socrates, a lot of philosophical inquiry was really concerned with the natural world,
Right.
with cosmology and physics.
Yeah.
And Socrates shifts the focus of philosophical attention to the question of how we should live.
And he does this through this very distinct method.
Right.
Yeah.
His famous Elingus.
Yeah, this method of relentless questioning.
Yes, constant question.
Always probing for these definitions of virtues like what is wisdom?
Right.
What is justice? What is courage?
And famously, he claimed that the unexamined life is not worth living.
Yeah.
So this idea that we need to constantly be scrutinizing our own beliefs and our own values.
Right. And this leads to a really important concept, I think, which is this idea of political expertise.
Right.
Or as the Greeks called it, politike techne,
Yes.
which is this idea that there is some form of knowledge, a skilled knowledge about how to govern.
Right. And he thought that this was something that could be learned and practiced.
Yeah, like a doctor
Right.
or a craftsman.
Yeah.
And this is where we start to see some of the political implications of Socrates' philosophy, because this really challenges the democratic norms of Athens.
Absolutely. Because Athenian democracy was based on the idea of widespread political participation. So Socrates is saying, well, actually, maybe only a few people really have the expertise to govern well.
Right.
Which obviously goes against the grain of that Athenian belief in the collective wisdom of the citizens.
Right.
And this philosophical disagreement wasn't just an abstract debate, right? It had some very real consequences.
Yeah.
For Socrates.
It led to his trial and execution.
Exactly.
So he's charged with impiety.
Right.
Introducing new gods.
Corrupting the youth.
And these charges, especially in a society where civic identity was so closely tied to religion, these charges had a lot of weight.
Absolutely. Because if you're corrupting the youth, you're essentially undermining the future of the city.
Right. And if we think about the broader political context, Socrates' trial can be seen as a reaction to this brief but really brutal rule of the 30 tyrants,
right,
which had just happened a few years earlier.
Yeah.
And some of Socrates' associates were actually involved in that regime.
Right.
So the restored democracy is understandably nervous about any potential threats.
Yeah.
They're worried about instability.
And Socrates' trial may have been a way of indirectly addressing some of those lingering anxieties.
It was a way of reasserting their authority.
So, in his own defense, Socrates actually articulates this really interesting new model of citizenship.
Yeah.
He doesn't see himself as just this private individual who's off doing his own philosophical thing.
Right.
He sees his mission of questioning and promoting virtue as a service to the city.
Yeah.
He famously compares himself to a gadfly.
Stinging the horse of the Athenian state.
Yeah, to wake it up and keep it moving.
Yeah.
And he even argues that he deserves to be publicly supported.
Right.
Like an Olympic champion.
Yes.
Who's honored for their service to the city.
That's right.
So this raises a really critical philosophical question about, well, how far does an individual's obligation to obey the law actually extend?
Right.
And in his defense speeches, as recorded by Plato, Socrates mentions a couple of times when he refused to comply with orders that he thought were either unjust or illegal.
Both under the democratic regime and under the previous oligarchy.
Yeah.
And he famously says that he would obey the divine command to philosophize over any human decree that told him to stop.
Which is a really radical statement.
Yeah.
Because he's basically saying that there's a higher authority than the state.
Right. So these remarks have led to a lot of debate about whether Socrates was advocating for some form of civil disobedience.
Right.
But what's really striking is that when he's actually facing his own death sentence, he chooses to submit to the legal process.
Yeah, which seems to contradict his earlier statements.
Right.
So how do we make sense of this?
Yeah.
Well, in Plato's dialogue, the Crito Socrates friend Crito tries to convince him to escape.
Right.
But Socrates argues against it.
Yeah.
And he does so by personifying the laws of Athens.
Okay.
And he basically says, look, I've benefited from these laws my whole life.
Okay.
I chose to live here, raise my family here.
Yeah.
I have a kind of implicit agreement with the city.
So there's this idea of a social contract.
Exactly. Although it's important to note that this contract isn't like a formal agreement.
Right.
It's more like this tacit understanding that arises from living in a particular place.
Yeah. And the laws even use this analogy of the relationship between parents and a child.
Right.
Or even a master and a slave.
Yeah. Which obviously highlights the unequal nature of this relationship
Right.
between the individual and the state.
Right. But they also include this really interesting clause, which is persuade or obey.
Yes, which seems to suggest that there is some space for citizens to try to change the laws through reasoned argument.
Okay.
But ultimately, if they fail to persuade, they still have a duty to obey.
Right. And that persuade or obey clause has been the subject of so much debate in political philosophy.
Oh, absolutely.
Particularly when we're thinking about, well, what are the justifications for civil disobedience?
Right.
But regardless of how we interpret that, Socrates' decision to accept his fate has really become this enduring symbol of this really complex relationship between philosophical inquiry, individual conscience, and political authority.
Yeah.
So from Socrates, we move on to his most famous student, Plato, whose Republic stands as one of the most influential works in Western philosophy.
Absolutely.
And unlike the Crito, which really explores this idea of justice without offering a definition,
Right.
the Republic undertakes this much deeper investigation.
Yeah, it's trying to actually define what justice is.
Yeah.
And it connects that to this idea of the harmonious ordering of the soul.
Right.
and ultimately to this higher understanding of goodness itself.
Which brings up an interesting point that there's a lot of debate about whether the Republic should primarily be categorized as a work of ethics or political philosophy.
Right, because as you've just pointed out, Plato weaves these two domains together so masterfully.
Right, and the dialogue famously starts with Thrasymachus,
Oh, yes.
who makes this very provocative claim that justice is just whatever benefits the stronger.
Yeah, the people who have the power.
And then Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, come in with this real philosophical challenge.
Yeah.
They say, well, assuming you could get away with acting unjustly, why would you choose to be just?
Yeah.
So right away, this has these massive political implications because it makes us think about, the figure of the tyrant.
The tyrant who seems to have it all.
Right, and who's seemingly happy.
Yeah.
So how do we square that with the demands of justice?
Right.
So Socrates responds to this challenge by embarking on this thought experiment.
Right.
Where he tries to trace the origins of the city back to these very basic economic needs.
Yeah.
But even in this very early stage, we see the seeds of a kind of ethical principle starting to emerge.
Right.
With the idea of individuals specializing in what they're best at.
Right. The division of labor.
Right. And then this social order evolves with the establishment of rulers.
Yeah.
And the rulers are supposed to have wisdom.
Right.
And their task is to maintain this balance within the city.
Yeah, to make sure that everything is functioning harmoniously.
Right, which is supposed to mirror the virtues within the individual soul.
Yeah.
So this leads to Plato's famous tripartite theory of the soul.
Right.
Which has reason, spirit, and appetite as its components.
Yes.
And that corresponds to the tripartite structure of the ideal city.
Right, with the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the producers.
Right. And then Plato defines these four cardinal virtues. Wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice.
Yes.
And these are not just individual traits, they're the conditions of a well-ordered soul and a well-ordered city.
Exactly. So what's really insightful about Plato's definition of justice is that it has this structural quality.
Okay.
So justice arises when each part of the soul and each class in the city is doing its own proper function.
Okay.
And not meddling in the business of the others.
Okay.
So when reason governs the soul and the wise guardians rule the city, with the other parts fulfilling their roles, that's when you have psychic health and civic unity.
And this is contrasted with the other forms of government, which Plato sees as inherently unstable and prone to conflict.
Right, because there's a kind of civil war going on within the city when you don't have this proper order.
Yeah. So in order to achieve and safeguard this unity within his ideal city, which he calls the Kallipolis,
right,
Plato proposes some really radical social arrangements.
Yeah.
Things like communal living for the guardian class.
Right.
The abolition of private property.
Yes.
And even private families.
Yes.
And strictly regulated procreation.
Yeah.
All aimed at making sure you get the best possible offspring for the state.
Right.
And as any student of philosophy will know, these proposals have generated huge debate and criticism.
Oh, absolutely.
From subsequent thinkers like Aristotle and Cicero.
Yes.
But the Republic isn't just about social and political structures. It's deeply integrated with Plato's epistemological and metaphysical theories as well.
That's right. Because the philosopher's claim to rule isn't based on practical skills or political maneuvering.
Yeah.
It's based on their knowledge of the forms.
Right.
And especially the form of the good.
So this knowledge gives them the truest understanding of justice.
Yeah.
And how to live the good life.
Exactly.
Which justifies their leadership.
Right.
Even though it seems paradoxical that these people who are dedicated to contemplation should be the ones who are tasked with the practical manners of governing.
Right. There's a real tension there.
So later in The Statesman, Plato shifts his focus a little bit.
Yeah.
And he dives more specifically into the definition of political expertise.
Right.
This politicae techne.
Yes.
And he uses this fascinating method where he makes these progressive distinctions between different types of knowledge.
Right.
So he distinguishes it from rhetoric.
Right.
Generalship.
Judging.
All of which are important in the political realm.
Yeah.
But they're not the same thing as politicae techne.
And The Statesman introduces this concept of kairos, which is the idea of correct timing and appropriateness in political action. So the true statesman, it's not enough for them to just have knowledge.
Yeah.
They have to understand how to apply that knowledge effectively.
Right.
At the right time and in the right way.
Okay.
And a big part of that is being able to weave together all these different elements of the citizenry.
Right.
To create a harmonious whole.
So the dialogue also raises this fundamental question of how do we think about rule by law versus rule by expert knowledge,
Right?
which is a debate that continues to this day.
Yeah.
The Republic largely takes this framework of law for granted,
Yeah.
but the statesman really directly addresses some of the limitations of law.
Yeah, because the law can be rigid.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be an imperfect substitute for the wisdom of a truly knowledgeable ruler.
Right. But it also acknowledges that in the absence of this ideal figure, the law is necessary.
Right.
It's a safeguard against the dangers of ignorance and self-interest.
Yeah.
And then we have Plato's last major political work, the Laws, which is where he presents what he calls a second-best regime.
Right.
So unlike the Republic, which has this very idealistic vision,
Yeah.
the Laws is much more grounded in the realities of political life.
Right. It's more pragmatic.
Yeah. So it allows for private property.
Yeah.
And it gives citizens a much larger role in political decision-making.
Right.
And this envisioned colony of Magnesia is still aiming at virtue as the ultimate goal of politics.
Yeah.
But it does so within this more achievable framework.
Yeah.
And it's often described as this mixed regime because it blends elements of monarchy and democracy,
Right. So it's trying to get the best of both worlds.
which is a model that had a huge influence on later political thought.
Absolutely.
And the Laws also gives us a much more positive view of law than we see in the Republic,
Right.
while still recognizing that it's limited compared to perfect wisdom.
Yeah.
It introduces this idea of a kind of double notion of law.
Okay.
So each law is supposed to be prefaced by this persuasive preamble,
Right.
which is this explanatory statement that's
Mhm.
supposed to help citizens understand why the law is there in the first place,
Right.
and to help them internalize the political ideals that underpin the law.
Yeah.
And these ideals are ultimately grounded in reason, which Plato calls noth.
Exactly. So the idea is that if people understand the reasoning behind the law, they'll be more likely to obey it willingly.
So this emphasis on promoting understanding and voluntary compliance through reason
Yeah.
really contrasts with the Republic's top-down approach,
Right.
where the philosopher kings are just assumed to have this superior knowledge that justifies their rule.
Yeah.
We also see a big shift in the laws in terms of who's eligible to hold office.
Right.
So in the Republic, it's this very small, select group of guardians.
Yeah.
But in the Laws, there's a much wider range of citizens who can participate in government.
Right.
And instead of the single, almost godlike statesman of the statesmen,
Yeah.
we have this nocturnal council, this group of elder statesmen who are tasked with overseeing the laws and making sure they're being implemented properly.
Yeah.
So this shift that we see in Plato's thought in the Laws has led to a lot of debate among philosophers.
Yeah.
Did he become more pragmatic in his later years?
Right.
Did he kind of give up on some of his more idealistic views in favor of something that was more achievable?
Yeah.
Or are there these deeper continuities in his work that we're just starting to appreciate now?
It's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And it really shapes how we understand Plato's political legacy.
So moving on from Plato, we come to his most famous student, Aristotle,
Yes.
who both builds on and departs from his teacher's ideas in really significant ways.
Yeah.
So one of the things that makes Aristotle so interesting is that he brings this much more empirical and systematic method to his inquiries.
Right.
He really wants to understand the complexities of actual existing political systems.
Yeah. He's not just interested in abstract ideals.
Yeah.
He wants to see how things actually work in practice.
And he also shows a lot of respect for different perspectives.
Yeah, he's very open to considering a wide range of viewpoints,
Yeah.
which is one of the things that makes his work so rich and enduring.
So one of the really central elements of Aristotle's thought is his teleological view of nature.
Right.
This idea that everything has an inherent goal or purpose.
Yeah. Atelos.
Yeah.
Atelos.
Which is naturally striving towards.
And for human beings, that ultimate purpose is eudaimonia,
Yes.
which is often translated as flourishing or living well.
Yeah, it's about living a life that's in accordance with virtue.
So Aristotle sees humans as unique in that we have this capacity for language and reason,
Right.
which allows us to engage in both practical reasoning, which guides our ethical and political actions, and theoretical reasoning, which is the domain of philosophy.
Right.
And he actually explores this question of which of these forms of life represents the highest form of human flourishing, the
Yeah.
life of action or the life of contemplation.
It's a debate that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah.
And it's still relevant today.
So for Aristotle, ethics and politics are inextricably linked.
Absolutely.
He famously argues that law is essential for most people to be able to act virtuously.
Right.
Because it provides this framework of habituation and external constraints.
Yeah, it helps us develop good habits.
Right.
And it keeps us from going astray.
So this is why he says that the study of ethics naturally leads to the study of political science and legislation.
Right.
Because if we want to understand how to live well, we need to understand how to create a just and virtuous society.
Exactly.
And his own work reflects this. So he put together this massive collection of constitutions.
Yeah, over 150.
Which are mostly lost now.
Unfortunately.
But we do have the Constitution of Athens.
Right.
Which is this really valuable insight into how a real political system actually functioned.
Yeah.
And in the opening of the Politics, Aristotle lays out this really nuanced framework for understanding constitutional expertise.
He considers the ideal constitution in abstract terms, the best constitution relative to particular circumstances, the best constitution on a hypothesis, and the type of constitution that's generally best for most states.
Yeah, so he's really trying to take a comprehensive approach to the study of politics.
He's not just trying to come up with one right answer.
Yeah.
He's trying to understand the different ways that political systems can be organized.
Yeah.
And the different factors that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about the best form of government.
Exactly.
So one of Aristotle's most famous and enduring claims is that man is by nature a political animal.
Yeah, zoon politikon.
Yeah, zoon politikon. Now, for our philosophical listeners, this doesn't just mean that humans tend to live in groups, right?
No, it's much deeper than that.
Okay.
For Aristotle, it's about our capacity for language.
Okay.
Specifically, our ability to talk about things like justice and injustice.
Right.
Good and bad.
Okay.
And he thinks that this capacity inherently orients us towards political community. So the polis isn't just some kind of convenient arrangement for protection or mutual benefit.
Yeah.
It's the natural arena where we can fully develop our potential as human beings and achieve eudaimonia.
So this idea of human plurality is central to Aristotle's thought.
Yes.
Which is interesting because it contrasts with Plato's vision of this much more unified state.
Right. For Plato, the ideal is for the city to be like one big happy family.
Yeah.
But Aristotle recognizes that.